Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. August saw Tamil Nadu, the state, present its revised budget for the year. It is no secret that the last year has been quite tough for states, both in terms of how much revenues have been stymied and indeed resources have been stretched in trying to cope with the pandemic. Also, no secret the fact that there are strong differences of opinion between the state government in Tamil Nadu and the central government in Delhi between issues of both policy and economics. What are the big challenges for Tamil Nadu as a state, and is a big reset possible in the years ahead? Joining me now to talk about that is Tamil Nadu's Finance Minister himself, Mr. Paranivel Thiagarajan. Thank you, Mr. Thiagarajan, for joining in and speaking with me. I know it's been a hectic patch for you ever since you took over. I thought we might divide our conversation into two parts. One, the budget and the internals of the state as you see them now. And the second, perhaps we could draw larger concentric circles on what's happening generally with center-state relations, a couple of important economic linkages over there, and how you see that panning out. Let me start first with what you laid out in the budget. And I think you've been quite candid about the fact that Tamil Nadu as a state is struggling with the debt burden it has at this point. Could you confirm what the exact figure is at this point in terms of the total debt burden on the state?
So the published figure as of the revised estimate of last year is about 4,85,000 crores as the public debt. But as you know, not all debt is public. So because of various constraints, and I've detailed this in a white paper that I published on the 9th of August, or rather I say I published in a sense, I signed my name to it in keeping with the tradition of Tamil Nadu, but I explained clearly that that was only because if there were any faults, I was taking responsibility, but it was actually the collective work of many. But that white paper shows that 39,000 something crores have been borrowed from the public fund, from the kind of cash balances and pension funds of the government servants and so forth over the last 5 years, in addition to this debt. So, it's more like 5 something. And then the projected debt for this year is somewhere between 90,000 and 1 lakh crores. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the end of March 2022, you're looking at government debt, public and otherwise managed out of cash balances somewhere over 6 lakh crores. And you're looking at about 2 lakh crores of debt on the TANGEDCos, TANTRANSCos and so forth, the electric utilities and the transport corporations. You add all the other debt in other entities, other PSUs, other kind of weighted implications of guarantees and stuff like that. So altogether, you're probably looking at about 9 lakh crores of liability, of which about 6 lakh crores is straight government debt, of which 570 or 580 will be public debt.
It cannot be an easy situation where you're looking at, even as a base case scenario, as you said, a 9 lakh crore figure in terms of debt. And at this point, Tamil Nadu is the top borrower in terms of states. What would you lay out as the path in terms of, debt de-escalation as you see it, perhaps even over a 2-year period? Because one understands that last year was difficult for states especially, but what do you think is a reasonable de-escalation target to set up?
So I guess I have about 5 different answers for this, or 5 different thoughts I want to throw out. So let me do them one by one. Okay. First, debt per se is not a problem. Of course, debt as a percentage of your GSDP or of your assets or whatever is the way bankers think of debt. Debt is not an absolute number. Much more concerning to me is the interest payments, because as the debts rise, the interest payments rise. But both of these we can look at quantitatively and say that at its best, the debt to GDP ratio about 7 years ago was about 16, 17%. Now it's about 27, 28%. The interest to revenue ratio was about 11%. Now it's about 21%. So very clearly then, my ambition stated in the white paper and in the budget is to find a path back to those levels, roughly. Back to about 11, 12% of revenues on interest, and back to about 17, 18% of GSDP in our case as debt. Now, there's two ways to do that. One is to slow the rate of increase of the top line, and the other is to increase the bottom line. So interest as a percentage of revenue, make sure you don't let the interest rise as fast, and you make sure the revenue rises much faster, and then the ratio drops. That's really the only way to do it, because no state ever goes into a debt repayment mode, at least not a developing state. A state in a developing country. So neither are we going to stop taking debt, nor will it come interest free. So whether you like it or not, the numerator in both cases is going to increase. The total debt's going to increase quantitatively in absolute numbers, and the total interest is going to increase correspondingly, absolutely, even if we were to restructure and bring down rates, which we are doing some and we can do some more. Of course, there's longer term structural solutions, but the easiest and most direct way to do this is to have good growth, and therefore your GSDP rises much faster than the rate of debt, and therefore the ratio comes down. And to have good revenue growth so that your revenue rises much faster than your interest payments and your ratio comes down. Of course, some of this is already in process. I think we will already show this year for the first time in 7 years that the total revenue deficit is lower than the year before. 7 years is escalated. We will de-escalate it this year.
I mean, that's the point I was coming to actually, sir, because I take your argument that debt per se is not a bad idea, especially not in the context of a post-COVID year. Most states and most economies have. But what do you do about the catch-22 that the state is facing in terms of revenues? On revenue receipts, do you feel that you're now in a harder space in terms of earning the revenue or hitting the run rate that you need to in order to balance off your debt burden concerns?
Yeah, I would say we're in a very unique situation, right? Much like other people, we have been affected by COVID. But the greatest problem for us came well before COVID. I've stated this multiple times, as has the CAG, as has the RBI, as has the 15th Finance Commission, in fact, that up until 2014-15 or so, Tamil Nadu used to be a revenue flat or revenue surplus state. It's only after that that we started becoming an increasingly revenue deficit state. And that has been as much driven, or in fact, mostly driven, I would say, by a shortfall in revenue rather than a great profligacy in spending. Let me just restate that. The problem is not that we grew our spending too fast. Of course, the interest payment component of it grew rapidly because the debt grew rapidly. But the rest of the spending actually did not grow as fast in the last 5 years as it did, let's say, when the DMK was in power in 6 to 11. The real problem was that the revenue sank like a rock. 3.5% of GSDP is the annual decline in revenue. We used to make about 10 and a quarter, 10 and a half ourselves, and about 3.5 from the union. So our total revenues would be about 14% of GSDP. The portion from the union has gone down a bit because of the finance commissions and various other problems with the union. It's gone down from 3.5 to maybe 3 or 2.75 or 2.8. But the real drop has come in our state's own revenues, which used to be 10 and a half, which have dropped pre-COVID to 7 and a quarter, 7.5, and post-COVID to 6.5, 6 and a quarter. So our real problem have been revenue shortfall. Now, I'll break that into two components. There is some small component on that, which is the shift from state sales tax and VAT to GST. Yes, GST is not a revenue neutral tax. We all understand that. And I've also pointed out that enforcement is so lax in other states compared to us that even on the IGST, which we ought to be roughly flat because we're a big consuming state, we're actually about 2,000 crores in the red. But the larger portion of that is just maladministration and lack of enforcement in commercial tax, in TASMAC, in the alcohol taxes and sales, in mining. The corruption or maladministration has been horrendous on the way in. Think about that. The estimated GSDP for Tamil Nadu this year is about 21,36,000 crores. 3% of that is about 65,000 crores. So we're losing about 65,000 crores a year in revenue, which is roughly our revenue deficit. So were we to make those revenues, we would be a revenue neutral state as we used to be before 2014.
Given that backdrop, in your recently presented budget, no additional levies, no state duties, no mention of the wealth tax that you did allude to in your white paper. Are you holding back and watching?
I would just disagree with one thing. I have never used the word wealth or words wealth tax anywhere in any paper
But you
ever.
have said who pays
But
the tax in any tax, just state the most.
yeah. So I'll say three things. I'll
Yeah.
say that we are already. I felt, and it was a clearly stated philosophy in my reply to the budget debate, that before I can ask other people to do their fair share, we must do our job properly. So by far, our single biggest priority is fundamental reform to prevent the leakages on the revenue side for the state of Tamil Nadu. Now, I don't want to get into specifics, but I can assure you that we are significantly better off in the last few months in terms of our tax collection because we have improved the compliance. I have also stated in the budget very explicitly the last 2 points before closing the budget. So I talked about all the other things, and I talked about the announcements and increases in spending or shortfall in revenue, like the 3 rupee petrol tax cut. And the last thing I said was we are going to fundamentally retool the commercial tax department and the enforcement department and the roving squads and the GPS-enabled trackers and the fast tags. And we are going to fundamentally transform the registration department where a lot of fraud happens. By coincidence, this morning, my colleague, the Honorable Minister for Commercial Taxes and Registration, has introduced a bill that I promised in the budget, which is A, that it will be a criminal offense to register documents with false evidence, and B, what we never had to now, which is the IG of registration himself or herself can actually cancel registrations that are palpably, provably false without having to go through a 6 or 8 or 10-year litigation. And whenever a registration is cancelled, it will call for criminal prosecution of the people who registered with the fake documents. Now, that is a huge change. That is a sea change. Those are the kinds of things we're focusing on. And so I've said very clearly, we see this in 2-3 parts. Part one, we must reform ourselves. Part two, when we have something to show, we'll go to the people and talk about the fairness of taxation, the fairness of fee collection, the fairness of rate setting. We would have taken it in this budget, except for the fact that we still haven't come out of COVID yet. So, we figured that while we were in the kind of semi-lockdown state, after we had just done a huge demand stimulus kind of spending, and after we were doing other spendings to other kind of revenue foregoing to facilitate demand, like the petrol tax cut and other kind of loan waivers of 2,800 crores to the women's self-help groups, which puts more money in their pockets and therefore they spend, that this was not the right time to be actually increasing the fee collection. So we will do that. We are committed to doing that for 2-3 reasons. We are one of the lowest taxing states, at least for one of the richer states. If you take the 4 rich states, Karnataka, Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Tamil Nadu, our rates are the lowest. Number two, they have not been changed in many cases for 8, 10, 15 years. Land values have not changed in many years. Vehicle registration has not changed in 15 years. Property tax has not changed in more than 8 years. These are not sustainable. And number three, if we compare ourselves to any benchmark, what is the rate in the city of Bangalore or the city of Ahmedabad, we are fundamentally off. We are much, much lower because of this lack of action. So we have justification to make it reset and to do it progressively. As I've said before, the problem with a lot of this taxation is that if you set flat rates, they become inherently regressive.
Okay.
So we must have progressive rates.
On this point of reform and fair taxation, I want to look at two verticals, which are not very large, but I think interesting in the context of what's happened in the state itself. One, the point has been made that if you look at the disaggregated figures for TASMAC, which is the public sector network of liquor shops, that's actually not gone down. And I think the concern is that it is the poor who are disproportionately contributing to that revenue. Is there some recalibration required? That's part one. And the second is the DMK government's claim that in the first 100 days, you've been able to reclaim over 600 crores worth of temple properties, restore them to the control of temples. You've had a fairly public run-in with Isha Foundation. Is that something as well that you want to take on as a major reform measure with, where you are a strong votary of the fact that states should be custodians of temples?
Yeah, again, you asked me questions that have like 5 or 6 packed into 2 questions. So I'm going to have
I'm trying to make the most of my 25 minutes with you.
So the answer to the first question is that the TASMAC numbers are a bit misleading. They need to be looked at very, very granularly. Okay. Around 2013, there was a change in the law of how excise collected by states, whether that was subject to central union income tax or not. So there was actually a shift in the nature of revenue raising from taxation, which used to be some component excise and some component sales tax. And the excise component went down a lot and it was rebased to sales tax. So my numbers show, A, that it has held steady. It has not gone down on the tax side. Therefore, if I include the fact that I lost the excise, it has actually gone down as a percentage of GSDP, which is the only benchmark, as you know. Everything else is subject to too much change in value based on inflation. And I will go one step further. Many instances, as well as kind of generic perception, is that there is a huge black market in liquor in Tamil Nadu. Huge black market. That means that there are millions and millions of bottles being sold without ever being registered into the system or excise or tax paid. So there is a huge room for improvement. And I'm already saying that there has not been any change in the taxation. Now, whether it falls on the poor rich, it's hard to say because we don't have data. So one of the things I've been saying from the beginning is that we got to figure out what is really happening. In many cases, we're like people operating in a room with the lights off, right? No windows and the lights off. We're just so bereft of data that it makes no sense whatsoever. So one of the 5 big announcements I've made of reform, I said improved and kind of change focus on technology and insights into the union center fiscal relationship, data-centric governance, fundamental reform of audit procedures within the government, internal audit and so forth, more computerization, transparency, efficiency of processes, and asset management, exactly the point you came to. It's not just temple lands that have been occupied, right? The CAG report shows that 2.05 lakh hectares, 4.5 lakh acres of government of Tamil Nadu land is under encroachment as of 2017. That number is probably much, much greater now. So I have made an initiative announcement in the budget that we're going to come up with a special initiative using drone technology, GPS, plus the government revenue records, plus the Tamil Nilam existing electronic database to do a fundamental new approach to the management of government assets, government land, government liquidity. It's a bit complicated. I don't want to go into the detail, but how these are the ways we reform ourselves. Now, separately, let's take 2 other issues. Isha has nothing to do with temples. Isha just happens to be a violator in itself of HACA and other guidelines, as the CAG report points out. That has nothing to do with temples. So they have to answer for the law, and in a country where the law was actually enforced, then they would have been called to account by now because they've admitted they've constructed without building permits. There's so much documentary evidence, and reasonable, intelligent people shouldn't be having a discussion whether they're in violation. It's in the CAG report, it's in their own writing, etc. The temples is because the man got involved with the temples and said that he supported the denationalization of temples, and I argued against it. These are our cultural heritage. These are the icons of our history. They belong to the people and they need to be managed by the people, which is represented by the government. There's no second thought about that in my mind. What I have said multiple times is a few things, which I'll say again, just so we have clarity. Who would we give it to? Were we to denationalize it, who would we give it to? Who decides who's a good Hindu or not a good Hindu? Who decides whether it should be local or remote? Should you sitting in Delhi be allowed because you're a Hindu to have some vote? Is it only Tamil citizens? Is it only Madurai people from Madurai temple or Madras people from Madurai temple because they happen to be greater devotees? The first question. Second question, on what basis would we ensure that that didn't have any politics in it? Would it be for life? What would we register those as? Societies? Third question, if everything is wrong, if everything in government that is corrupt needs to be privatized, why don't we privatize education and the water system and railways? Everything has got corruption in it. Is there anything that's not got corruption? Fourth question, if this is the general stand of people of the rightist value system, Why is it that within the last 15 years, the BJP government under then Chief Minister Mr. Modi in Gujarat and currently the BJP government in states like Uttarakhand are very busy nationalizing temples? How is there one rule if it's a BJP state and if there's a different rule if it's not a BJP state? It makes no sense whatsoever. Assets that used to belong to the kings, that used to belong to the emperors, are the ones that have been nationalized. Out of the lakhs and lakhs and lakhs of temples in Tamil Nadu, only 30 something thousand of them are under the HRCE. Now, let me make another point. This genius in Isha, right? I don't want to go further into his background and lack of probity. That individual said, "Oh, there are 11,000 temples for which a daily puja is not happening." Did he spend 1 rupee? Did he do one thing about it? Other than mourn about the fact that it was not happening, what did he do? It turned out the reason it was not happening was because the government had invested some money from which the daily cash interest was supposed to be servicing those pujas. That had become too little because of inflation. So what did we do? We, the government, put in another 135 crores into that corpus fund, doubled the daily payments coming out of interest, and we are now ensuring that those 11,000 temples have puja done at least once a day. That is the DMK government. That is the government that talks for nationalization. What did this guy do?
All fair points. And I do hope that the CAG report is taken on board in some form and fashion. Just one final question on the internals before we move to the larger picture. You did announce an assistant, a COVID assistance package to ration card holders, but I think do you feel like there was an opportunity missed in terms of what you could have done for the urban poor? Again, that's something you pointed to in the white paper. It has been discussed by a parliamentary standing committee as well, and the importance of it, given what we're seeing with unemployment numbers, Mr. Tyagarajan, was that something you could have considered?
Actually, the white paper was not the basis for announcing schemes, right? It was just a status report, if you will. In the budget, we have announced that we'll have a pilot urban unemployment coverage scheme, or the equivalent of MNREGA for urban areas. And because we're doing it in a pilot way, we're only going to do it in a few cities this year, and we've only allocated 100 crores just to get it started. But this is something we're very keen on. Our global advisors, including Professor Raghuram Rajan and Professor John Braze, and in fact, Professor Duflo, and in fact, Dr. Arvind Subramanian, have talked about this in the past. And so we are acutely aware of the need. Now, let's not put these two in the same bucket, right? The rationale for giving the 4,000 was to stimulate demand and give immediate protection to the poorest, and most of all, to fulfill a campaign promise, which was based on something we had said last year. We had asked the government to give 5,000, it only gave 1,000. So we said, if we come to power, we'll give you the remaining 4,000. So that was the logic. That doesn't mean that we put that instead of something else. That happened independent of the white paper, independent of the budget. It happened as soon as we came to office, because the chief minister felt that we should honor that commitment. And I was all for it, not that it mattered, but I was all for it because that's what economic theory says, that you stimulate demand when you have a crisis and when you have a lack of earnings. Now, I was the first guy to admit that our data systems were not good enough. We could have done the delivery with more precision, with less wastage, with more with some savings. But we were in a hurry. We were coming to power after 10 years. We needed to get the money in the hands of people as quickly as possible. I can tell you now that between, let's say, May 7th when we took office and today, which is September 2nd, not yet 4 months, our data systems have been greatly enhanced. We have paid so much attention to this that we have correlated almost every database we have, from family, child welfare, ration cards, voter data. And we are probably, not more than 2 or 3 steps away. We're asking the union government for data like income tax pays and so forth. And this data is just amazing. As it has been shown, I think my colleague, the Honorable Minister for Cooperation, pointed out in the Assembly, and in fact, 2 of us rode together to a funeral, so we were talking about it in the car, that the dual loan waiver that had been kind of originally estimated at X, let's say the cost was, I don't know, some 15,000 crores, let's say, it's somewhere in that range. When we actually go and remove all the fraudulent cases, the multiple applicants, the guys who, saw the scheme coming and put in fake papers, the board members of the cooperatives, etc., A huge proportion of that is fraud. A huge proportion, not like 5, 10. I'm saying more than 50% of that is cases that are not eligible, that were gaming the system to be able to get the loan waiver. So data underlies a lot of these things. And if we have data, I think we can greatly improve the delivery. Let me just say 2 or 3 things to finish this segment. I have said very clearly that our leader's philosophy in Tamil, which was Ellorukum Ellam, everything for everyone, I interpreted it slightly in granularity, and I said, Ellorukum Ellam, Samuha Porladare Nidiki Erpa, everything for everybody, in keeping with social and economic justice and fairness. So that doesn't mean everybody gets everything for free. The poor get it for free. The next level pay a little bit. The rich pay full price, etc. Mm. And I said, in fact, what we see today is the exact opposite. What we see today is whoever can grab onto whatever is happy to, is welcome to take it and go away. That's how bad the system is, because there's no enforcement, no data, no backing, no attempt at discipline. Number one. Number two, it is my considered opinion that not only are we losing about 30-35% on the way in, as already proved by the 15th Finance Commission, in fact, proved by the 14th Finance Commission's estimate of what Tamil Nadu's own revenue should have been and what they turned out to be is almost exactly that gap of 35% or 3.5% of GSDP. But on the way out, I believe that we are highly inefficient. If we attempt to spend 1 rupee on a particular purpose, I'd be shocked if we got 65, 70 paisa to that end. And that I'm on the record as saying. So that is something we need to fix again. And so if I put all of this together and say, were we to consider the profound kind of fundamentals, we are an enormously rich state. We sit on so many assets that are liquidatable. I'm not even talking about PSUs and all. I'm not even going down to land. I'm saying publicly traded company shares upwards. We have so many liquidatable assets. We are inherently resilient because of the level of education and social inclusion. We have one of the lowest Gini coefficients of any state, at least of any large industrial developed state. We are number one by far. We have a much better social development index than any of the rich states. We have much better infant mortality, maternal mortality, percentage of girls in schools. Any of these you take compared to the other rich states or other large states. So we are in a very good place. In fact, the profound problem is that administration is failing. It's not just failing in Tamil Nadu. It's failing all over India, as best I can tell. Tamil Nadu just happens to be a particularly egregious case over the last 5-6 years because of a lack of political leadership. But the system is not designed to succeed. That is my perception after a few years. And that's why we're so focused on reform.
Speaking of liquidation of assets, the Tamil Nadu state government has gone on record to say they are quite unhappy with the idea of the NMP, or the National Monetization Pipeline. I think, what I'm trying to ask is, how do you plan to escalate it? I was speaking with former Finance Minister, Mr. Chidambaram, who pointed out that it was highly unlikely this would reach the parliament for debate. How do states take coherent action to push back against something that may impact assets housed within, their geographical boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, maybe I missed it, but I haven't seen the official kind of communication that the government itself is against anything. I was asked to comment, and I gave some comments in my capacity as finance minister, but I haven't seen any official
saying that they are very unhappy.
Okay, yeah, but these are comments. I mean, comments are comments as opposed to resolutions passed in the law. In the House, or official statement. So, of course, we are against the privatization of assets like Chennai Airport or Trichy Airport. Of course, we are going to make our views known to the union government. The fundamental problem, I think, today is that the union government is not interested in inclusive decision making or debate as the precursor to outcomes, right? The functioning of parliament has been there for everybody to see. The proportion of bills that are sent to committee, the extent of debate that happens on any bill, the amount of flexibility before anything is made into law. All these have suffered greatly over the last few years. I don't think it's within my pay grade Though I'm the finance minister, as I point out multiple times, I'm number 26 in seniority out of 34 ministers in the cabinet because our seniority goes strictly based on protocol. How early were you an MLA? When was the first time you were a minister, etc., etc. And on that protocol, since I only entered politics 5 years and 4 months ago, I'm far down the scale. So I'm not going to, if it's about GST, I comment because I'm the member representing Tamil Nadu on the GST Council. If it's about our state's finances, I comment. If it's about our government's policy relating to something, then I'm not sure I'm the right guy to comment.
Okay, let's talk about GST, on which I think you've been quite vocal and on record with your concerns both about the structure and about the GST Council. There is currently some kind of political cementing underway where West Bengal's chief minister is looking at getting like-minded parties and minds together. Do you think there's an opportunity over there for economic cementing as well, Mr. Tyagarajan? Because many states have made the point that you have. Tax revenues have not grown under the GST regime. This has been tilted towards the center, not the state. Do you think there's an opportunity there?
Yeah, I see it much more fundamentally than that, as I've said before. This notion that you can have a one nation, one X policy is just a contradiction in terms. I'll give you an example. Yesterday...
Itself is a problem as a concept?
No, I'm saying GST is an example. Yeah, okay. GST is an example. I'm saying, I didn't catch your question. I said, if you think that you can homogenize policy making across the country, one nation, one X, whether that's one nation, one language, one nation, one tax, one nation, one medical exam, one nation, one ration card, all of these are inherently a contradiction in terms because the extent of variability is so high across states, not just by the fact that they were divided based on linguistic and cultural differences, but because the development of them has separated so far. Like the doctor-patient ratio in Tamil Nadu is probably 7 times better than the doctor-patient ratio in the poorest states in the Hindi belt. 7 times, not once, not twice, right? So when you start looking at places which have such great divergence, and I'll give you an example. Yesterday, the MLA from Coimbatore South, Mrs. Vanati Srinivasan, spoke in the assembly, and she asked for, or day before, she asked for training and skilling programs to be custom developed for each district based on the kinds of industries and the agricultural products that were unique to that district.
Okay.
Makes a lot of sense. That's what we've been saying for the longest time. But that is called local self-governance. That is the direct opposite, the 180-degree opposite of, we will tell you in Delhi when you should open barber shops in your district, right? So I'm saying, like this notion that you can have a centralized regime in itself is inherently flawed. And I'll give you an example in GST. In GST, at the 43rd Council, one of the ideas that came up for discussion was, for ease of doing business, should it be that the below 5 crore turnover so-called small payers, who right now have to file every quarter but pay in their dues every month, should that restriction be further eased, that they only have to pay every 3 months and file every 3 months? Clearly, that makes doing business easier. It is the exact states who earlier had said, no, we can't be seen as small states, different from big states, all states are the same states, who went on protest. They said, we can't afford it. We are small states. Most of our payers are below 5 crores. We don't have any large industries. Were you to go to saying they can only pay once in 3 months, our liquidity model would get damaged. We have to pay salaries and ration systems and all that every month. But we'd only get GST every 3 months. So we cannot afford to do ease of doing business for the small payers because most of our payers are small payers. Now, I, on the other hand, on behalf of Tamil Nadu, said my best guess is that less than 15% of my GST payers are below 5 crore turnover. Total volume of money received. So if it were really in the national interest and were you to want to go to that, though it would cause some constraints for us, I'm okay with it. But that's why it's so different. Every state has a different situation. But I made points there which I'm making again to you in case you didn't hear that debate earlier, where I said A, even if you were to go to 3 months, you don't have to make everybody go synchronously on January, April, July, October. You can asynchronize them to make sure that every 1/3 of the payers go that schedule, 1/3 go February, May, and so on, and 1/3 go March, June, and so on, so that you could still manage liquidity by just having a staggered schedule of when the 3-month period went. That never was considered. The second point I made, why are we having this discussion in the dark? Surely GSTN, the recipient of all GST data and the keeper of all records of all transactions throughout the whole country, surely GSTN could have done a back of the envelope or a kind of rough cut state by state to say, in Tamil Nadu, 85% comes from large payers who file monthly and pay monthly, 15%. In Karnataka, it's 60-40. In Gujarat, it's 75-25, whatever. Shouldn't we have come into this discussion with that data so we could have made informed decisions? Why are we all talking philosophically without any information? So this is why I say that, the rush to get this GST done, not only did it leave limitations in the design, it left serious limitations in the implementation, and it is still functioning, in my opinion, suboptimally, even for the design that already exists. Right? Why don't we use data? We have data. Why don't we use it? Doesn't seem to ever come to the meeting.
One final question on this point about local governance and thinking about creating solutions within a district or within a state. I was intrigued at the time of the elections when I came across in the manifesto for DMK a mention of the fact that they will bring in a law to reserve 75% of jobs in the state for Tamils. Would you like to clarify that? Was that just for public or also for private enterprises? Is this a reaction to the move announced by the Haryana government? And what is the logic behind it?
Again, I'm not going to go into that because I'm not. It's not my portfolio. But let me tell you a related point that I am working on, that is in my portfolio. So, as the Minister for Human Resources Management, which means the government's human resources management, which includes, of course, the entire recruiting gamut, which the Tamil Nadu Public Service Commission, plus the new things like the DVSC and the Lokayukta and all that. We are going to fundamentally improve the design of the intake model, the intake funnel, to ensure that there is very little likelihood of repetition of what happened a few years ago, where a large number of government jobs, AEs in the electricity board and in other government jobs, went to out-of-state people. Now, that the system is so bad because of a lack of data, and I filed a case, so I'll give you an even more kind of open example of that. After NEET came in, the law allows us to have a nativity test of who is considered an in-state native and who is not. And we are allowed to reserve seats for in-state natives at a ratio and out-of-states in the all-India quota. Okay. There was such a fiasco of how badly that was done that I was forced to go to court in 2017. I got a stay. It was so obvious and so blatant. I got a stay against the admission process for medical seats underneath. But by then, the bulk of the admissions had been done. So the stay was effectively invalid because the government issues a new GO every year with new guidelines for how you test for nativity. Because of all the work I did and all that, when the cases were finally heard, it became apparent that hundreds, probably between 400 and 500 students, had either forged documents or invalid documents or hid the fact that they were from other states and also had nativity in other states. So between 400 and 500 admissions out of the total of 3,000 whatever government seats were people who had violated the system. By then it was too late, because were you to now take action against them and throw them out, not only would their lives and their education be ruined, but you couldn't fill those seats again. You cannot create fresh second-year medical graduate students. You see, you have to get, medical students, you have to get people who have crossed the first year. So the system is so broken that I am for the principle that there should be preference. I am not even able to get satisfaction that the nativity of medical college admissions and of government job intake has been fixed yet. So I don't want to comment on that. The person whose department that is will work on it.
Okay, fair point. I appreciate your response. Thank you very much for joining in and speaking with me. I wish you luck at the GST Council meeting and outside of it, and I'm sure we'll speak more often over the next couple of months. Thank you, sir.